Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a stack of sources here about a new protocol called PinLink, and our mission today is really to unpack what it is, what problem it's trying to solve, and how its approach aims to be different based on what we're seeing here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the core concept, it seems, is that PinLink is positioning itself as the first RWA tokenized DePIN protocol.
Right. That's the headline claim.
It's a bit of a mouthful, but let's try and break that down.
Okay. So when we dig into the materials, they definitely talk up the promise of DePINs, decentralized physical infrastructure networks. For AI developers, the idea is, well, pretty appealing on the surface. Decentralized access to hardware like GPUs, TPUs, CPUs, cloud storage.
Right, the physical stuff you need for heavy compute tasks.
Exactly. And typically the incentive there is, token rewards for the people actually connecting their hardware to the network.
Okay. But here's where it gets interesting based on these sources. The core issue they identify right away is that while current DePINs do deliver the decentralization part, they haven't really or consistently delivered significant cost savings compared to just going with the big centralized cloud providers.
Exactly. That seems to be the crux of it. That lack of, let's call it, capital efficiency is presented as a major hurdle for wider adoption, especially, in the AI market where costs are such a huge factor.
Okay, so that's the problem statement. And this is where PinLink comes in.
Right.
It's presented explicitly as a protocol designed to fix that cost problem. And its main weapon is this RWA tokenized model.
Yeah, and the RWA part, the real-world asset tokenization, that's the fundamental shift they're highlighting. So traditional DePINs, as we see in the sources, they mostly reward the hardware owners with a slice of the rental fees paid by users. Pretty straightforward.
Standard rental model, basically.
Yeah, but PinLink adds this whole other layer. If you own a DePIN asset on their network, you can also mint an RWA token, specifically an ERC-1155 token that represents your actual physical hardware.
Okay, an ERC-1155. So that allows for, fractional ownership too, right?
Exactly. That's the key part. You mint this token representing your GPU or whatever, and then you can sell fractional shares of that token to other people, to third parties.
Whoa, okay, so it's not just about renting out the compute time anymore.
No.
You're actually enabling trade in the underlying asset itself, or at least fractions of it, on-chain.
Precisely. It integrates asset ownership and trading directly into the DePIN model.
Which creates, I guess, a totally different kind of incentive structure, right? Drawing from RWA trading.
Yeah, it taps into that whole world. And the documentation really lays out how this is meant to benefit, well, pretty much everyone involved in different ways.
Okay, let's walk through that. Who benefits first? The asset owners.
Right. Let's start with the DePIN asset owners. For them, the big win described is flexibility. Massive flexibility in monetization. Instead of just waiting for rental income, they can choose. Sell some RWA token fractions now for upfront capital if they need cash, or maybe hold the tokens for the long-term rental stream, or, do a bit of both.
Okay. So they can tailor it to their own financial situation.
Exactly. The sources suggest this helps them meet dynamic goals and potentially keeps them more invested in the network long-term. Better retention.
That makes sense. You're giving them more financial levers to pull. Okay, so how does that translate into helping the AI developers? Because they're the ones needing the cost savings, right?
Right. And this is where it gets particularly interesting for the AI developers. See, in a traditional DePIN, the capital flowing in is mostly just from those rental payments. With PinLink, because of the RWA layer, capital comes in from two sources, the rentals and the sales of those fractional RWA tokens.
Okay, two pools of money flowing in.
Exactly. And this dual inflow is specifically designed to ease the cost burden on the developers renting the hardware.
How does that work mechanism-wise?
There's this thing called the Service User Rebate Fund. It's funded by taking a commission, a small percentage, from the RWA token sales.
Okay.
That commission money goes into the fund. Then the fund itself is put to work deployed in yield-generating DeFi activities, basically.
So it's earning interest or yield.
Correct. And the yield earned by that fund is then used to give rebates back to the AI developers who are renting the compute capacity.
So the RWA sales indirectly subsidize the rental costs for developers.
That's the idea. It effectively lowers their net cost.
Clever. What about the hardware quality itself? Sometimes decentralized networks struggle with consistency for, serious AI work.
Good point. The materials do mention that. They talk about PinLink having an asset vetting process and also an initial strategy where they prioritize using protocol-owned assets. This whole approach seems geared towards ensuring they can offer, enterprise-grade, reliable, scalable hardware specs that AI developers actually need, addressing that potential weakness of some existing marketplaces.
Okay, so you've got owners getting liquidity, developers getting lower costs through this rebate fund. What about people who don't own the expensive hardware? Can they get involved?
Yes, that's the next group. The third-party passive income seekers. These are individuals, maybe DeFi users, yield farmers, who don't have their own GPUs to plug in, but they can buy those fractional RWA token shares from the asset owners.
Okay. So they buy a piece of someone else's hardware token.
Exactly. And by owning that fraction, they get to earn a proportional share of the rental income that the underlying physical asset generates.
So it's a way to get exposure to DePIN hardware earnings without owning the hardware.
Precisely. The sources present this as attractive for diversifying into real-world assets. It opens up DePIN participation beyond just the hardware owners themselves.
Which could mean more people involved, potentially more decentralization.
And another source of capital coming into the ecosystem, absolutely.
Right. Makes sense. Okay, and what's in it for PinLink itself, the protocol?
Well, for PinLink, the protocol, the benefit is diversified revenue streams. They're described as taking protocol fees on both the rental transactions and the RWA token purchases.
So income from usage and from asset trading.
Correct, a broader base. And there's also this concept mentioned, an asset expansion flywheel.
Okay.
The idea seems to be, PinLink starts by operating some of its own DePIN assets. When these are utilized, they plan to prioritize selling fractional RWA shares of these specific protocol-owned assets. The upfront capital they generate from selling those fractions can then be plowed right back into buying more DePIN hardware.
So using the RWA mechanism to fund its own growth and capacity expansion.
Yeah, potentially accelerating network growth. That seems to be the logic.
Okay, so that RWA tokenization really is the engine driving a lot of these unique mechanics.
It definitely appears to be the core innovation highlighted.
Now, beyond that core model, the sources do seem to touch on a few other components, right? Other parts of the PinLink offering.
Yes, definitely. Looking at the structure of the documents, they mention several other pieces. There's something called the PinAI Performance Optimization Suite.
PinAI?
Yeah, it sounds like it uses machine learning potentially to optimize how the connected assets perform. Maximize efficiency, maybe?
Interesting. Okay, what else?
We also see references to an IVI ecosystem suggest maybe a broader set of interconnected services or a larger vision.
Right.
And it mentions the asset vetting process again, which we touched on, reinforcing that focus on quality for enterprise users. And also a staged rollout strategy, so they're planning a phased launch.
Gotcha. And I think you mentioned there's even more detail available.
Oh, yeah. The source materials point to whole sections on tokenomics and utilization. So the role of the native PIN token, how value accrues, the revenue model in more detail, PIN staking mechanisms. And for anyone wanting the really deep dive, they mention specific product guides, like for their mainnet and staking, plus references to other white papers like RWA 2055 and Pinance. So lots more beneath the surface.
Okay, so plenty more to dig into if you really want to go deep. But for this deep dive, focusing on the core problem and solution presented, the absolute key takeaway seems to be this RWA tokenized model. It's that blend of traditional DePIN rentals with this new layer of fractional asset ownership and trading.
Exactly. And the stated goal, the overarching aim that comes through again and again in the materials, is really twofold. Drive down infrastructure costs for AI developers, while simultaneously creating these new, much more flexible ways for hardware owners to generate revenue and get liquidity. Basically, trying to build a more capital-efficient and maybe a broader DePIN ecosystem.
Which really leads to quite a big question, doesn't it?
I think so. And it's maybe the thought to leave you with based on all this. What does the future actually look like if physical infrastructure assets, and not just computing power, but maybe, they mentioned things like sensors, wireless networks as potential future areas?
Right.
What if all these things can be easily tokenized as RWAs, fractionalized, and then traded instantly globally? How does that change, fundamentally, how we think about owning things, accessing essential resources? And maybe just as importantly, how does it change how capital flows into building out all this critical physical infrastructure that, well, we clearly need for whatever comes next?
That's a really powerful thought. Thinking about those potential ripple effects, how tokenizing real-world hardware could reshape things. Definitely a great place to wrap up this deep dive.